When you have stress, play chess. When you fall on your ass, play chess for a real deal, for Christian Seal.
Hello everybody. Today I will show you my game against the Russian Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk, who is currently ranked number 6 in the world and played in the FIDE Candidates tournament. So the game took place during his Banter Blitz challenge, and I opened the game with the move knight f3. I was playing with the white pieces. He answered this with the King's Indian defense, knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and I went for the classical main line, which arises after the move bishop to e2. Now he went for the main move e5 and expected a very tense game. Yet I had other ideas here and I played my pet move, the move d takes e5. So this move has been taught to me by my former coach Thomas Jakelen. Thanks a lot for that. And after takes bishop g5, we reach the main position of the classical exchange King's Indian. Black has a lot of different moves here. So for instance, black can go rook e8, rook f8, c6, knight a6, knight bd7. So black is really up for choice here. And Grischuk went with the move c6, which is played by several strong players in this position. Well, I took on e5. And now the black idea is to actually capture the pawn on e4. To do this, he played the move rook to e8. So now he attacks my knight, and after knight f3, he can just take on e4. The main move in this position is the move long castles for white, but I didn't want to do that. Instead, I played the line which I play almost exclusively in this position, namely rook to d1. So this is a move, again, shown to me by Thomas Jakelen. And black now cannot take on e5. This is a little trick. So after rook takes e5, white has rook d8 check. After knight e8, I can just take on c8. And after rook takes e8, I can take on f6. And now he cannot take back the bishop because the rook is hanging. And if he takes the rook, I just take back and white is a pawn up. So therefore, after rook d1, he went for the move knight a6, renewing the threat of taking on e5, and I just went back to f3. So now again, he cannot take on e4, because then I would just take back and go rook d8 check. We're going to see that line in a minute anyhow. So he played knight c5, attacking the e4 pawn, and I played the move knight to d2. So now I will show you this line with knight takes e4 once. So it just takes, 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 takes. And now his back rank is just way too vulnerable. I get rook d8 and bishop h6 with a deadly threat of mating him on f8. So note here that black has a funny trick in this position, which is to take on e2. And now if I were to take back, he could go bishop g5 check, followed by rook takes d8. So now white should just play king f1. And now rook f8 mate is a very big threat. And therefore, the only thing he can basically do is to go bishop d7, because now he could take back on f8. But now I just have rook takes a8, and let's say rook e8. I can just exchange everything and have an endgame in which I'm an exchange up, and the position is just winning for white. So therefore, after knight d2, he cannot take on e4. And the strongest move in the position is probably h6, which was played against me in the Belgian league by Arthur Pipers. But instead, Grischuk chose to play the move a5. After a5, white is now really a pawn up because I can go bishop e3. And now he doesn't have h6, which would have created some luft for the king. So therefore, he can still not take on e4. Yeah, and now he made another mistake. Probably he should go maybe knight fd7 or something. So instead, he went for the move knight to e6. which would now have allowed me a very strong continuation. So maybe you can try to pause the video and you can try to see what white could do in this position. Well, the strongest move would have been just e5, knight d7 and f4. And now I'm threatening knight d4, knight d6. And I guess the only reasonable option he has here would be to go f5, but then he's just a pawn down for nothing. Plus his two bishops don't really play, so it's just clearly better for white. Therefore, after knight e6, I could have gotten a large advantage by playing e5, but it was a 3-minute blitz game, so I didn't see that. Instead, I went for another logical option, which is just castles, but which is, of course, a little bit slower. Maybe again now he should have played knight e7 immediately, but he went a4, which maybe would allow me again to go e5, f4. But I didn't see that, and I was a little bit nervous because Grischuk is known to be a very tricky player. So I was nervous that he gets a3 and then he somehow uses this bishop to target my unprotected knight on c3. Therefore, I played a3 on my own. So now to keep the protection of the c3 knight by this pawn on b2. And he answered that with a move knight to d7. After knight d7, he now threatens different jumps. So there is the jump knight e5, maybe one of the knights to c5 or knight to d4. So for instance, if I go knight f3, he could play knight ec5 and attack the e4 pawn, and now I would already have a difficult task to solve. Therefore, after knight d7, I played the move f4 now, with the idea of going e5, followed by knight d4. But this took me 30 seconds, which is a lot in such a blitz game, and he answered that now almost immediately with knight d4, and threatens now to take on e2. I cannot really prevent this, so I just went for e5, and he took on e2. So he now grabbed the pair of bishops, takes, and played the move f6, threatening to win the pawn on e5 back. The main idea of f6 is that I cannot take on f6 because then he just has rook takes e3, and now e2 is hanging. So if I take on g7, he takes on e2, and he's just better. So therefore, after f6, I have to come up with something else. And I think what I did was pretty good. I played the move knight to e4. And this is quite often a nice idea. So when black attacks with multiple pieces on e5, so in this case, black has 3 pieces, or 4 pieces, which all attack this pawn on e5, then what you sometimes want to do is you just want to give it, play knight e4, and after f takes e, just go e5, and all of these pieces still look at this pawn on e5 and are therefore restricted. So that's a typical motive to allow f takes e and then go f5. I played knight d6 first. This doesn't make a big difference. He played rook d8, and now just f5. So I think until here, besides missing this e5 move, I played decently well. But now, after knight f6, I made a pretty big mistake. So in his version of things, you can see that he shook his head because he couldn't believe that I played knight takes c8 in this position. And indeed, it's a pretty bad move. So I played knight takes c8, which gives away most of my advantage. Instead, I should probably have gone for bishop b6. And now you can see that my pieces are much more active than his pieces, and the position is definitely better for white, probably even clearly better for white. Now, as I said, instead I went for knight takes c8, which now allowed him to just recapture. And at this point, I was pretty happy already if I could reach a draw. So takes, and now I went for knight c3. The idea of knight c3 is to attack the pawn on a4 and also to restrict this knight a little bit, not to allow him to go knight e4. He now went for knight g4, attacking my bishop, with a very interesting idea. So his idea will now show after bishop b6, takes, takes, and e4. This is actually really well played, because at first sight I thought still maybe I have a small advantage objectively, but after e4 it's very difficult for white to play this position. The main issue is that if I take on e4, he just has bishop takes b2, and now it's already quite unpleasant for me because I have to defend this pawn on a3 to avoid giving him a free pawn. So therefore, I can't really go knight takes e4. And yeah, maybe I should take on a4, but then like all of my pieces are away from my king, and this pawn might get very strong. So therefore, I decided to try to simplify things with the move c3, intending to go, probably if he takes on c3, I could either take back or even just take on g4. So therefore, he decided to go knight e5, attacking my pawn on c4. And the issue is still that this knight is now very unpleasant, especially with this pawn structure. So once he takes on c4, b2 will be weak, a3 will be weak, and black's position could become better momentarily. So therefore, I now played bishop d4 and inviting him to take this pawn on c4. Takes, takes, and now I just went knight takes e4. Because now I realized at least I get a lot of counterplay now with rook d7 check if he takes on b2. So I think he is probably worse if he takes on b2 and I get rook d7 check. Then I win the b7 pawn back and his king is pretty weak. So therefore he decided to play a stronger move. Rook d7 is threatening. Note that if he goes rook e8, I just have knight d6, takes, takes, and we transpose to a drawn rook ending. So I guess he still wanted to play on to beat a weak player like me with a move rook to c7. But now I have knight c5, aiming for a fork on e6. And he has to avoid the fork by playing rook e7, and now I can just take on a4. Yeah, this position looks better for white at first glance because I'm a pawn up, but it turns out he has a lot of dynamic counterplay now. So he went for b5, knight c5, won back the pawn on b2, and now I have rook d6. So here I still thought maybe I'm objectively a little bit better, but yeah, he proved otherwise by just going knight c4, takes, and takes on a3. The point being that after rook b6 now, my idea was that g6 becomes weak and this knight on a3 looks a little bit dim on the rim. So therefore, he now tried to organize counterplay and actually tried to use the fact that he has this passed pawn and at the same time just give up this pawn on g6. So I did not see that coming too much. He went for rook e2, check, and just gave up the pawn on g6. So I thought objectively this should be good for me, just taking the pawn on g6. But it turns out that this is not easy at all, and black should have enough counterplay to secure a draw. In fact, after knight c4, I even got a little bit nervous because knight e3 is now coming. And the king also feels a little bit endangered. Plus, the b pawn is going to run. c6, knight a3, attacking g2, check, and g4. Now he went b3, pushing the pawn further, and I now wanted to try to win the pawn back with the move rook b6, maybe with the intention of going knight d3. b3, and now I went knight c6 check, so he cannot really go king to d6, because then I think I just have this check, and I can take on b3. Yeah, and even this is not working, I guess, because of king h1. takes and takes on e3. So therefore, after knight c6 check, he went king to f7. I went knight d4, taking the pawn on b3. Yeah, and now I had basically calculated a line which is just rook g2 check, king h1. He's pretty much forced to go b2. And now if he gets one more move in with the move rook d2, then he threatens rook d1 check, b1 check, b1 queen. But fortunately, I can still stop this with the move knight to f5. If he takes, then I can take the rook. So that's not feasible. Thus, he has to go rook e2, takes, and yeah, now he can just go rook e1 check, which is what happened in the game. King g2, queen, takes, and we reach a drawn endgame. Now I just offered a draw because I didn't want to try to flag him or him flagging me in the end, whatever, because the position is just a draw. The idea being that if black wants a draw, can just, for instance, defend with king on the 6th rank and maybe the rook on b5. And then once I advance my pawn to the 5th rank, black can take it off, and we will end up with just one knight against a king, which is a draw. So thanks a lot for Alexander Grischuk to accept my offer. Thanks a lot to Chess24 for setting up this great Banter Blitz. And I'm looking forward to see you in the next video. Bye-bye.